Tim Walz is quite a big fan of communist China. I came across this article the other day. The headline says Walz praised Chinese communism as system where, quote, everyone shares. This was published on August 19th. The first couple paragraphs say, as a high school teacher in the 1990s, Democratic vice presidential candidate and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz appeared to extol life under Chinese communism, telling his students that it is a system in which, quote, everyone shares and gets free food and housing. I know Steve's going to comment on that in a moment.
Tim Walz went to China for the first time right after the Tiananmen massacre. Remember, that was the time when people were fleeing China. That was the time when American businesses were reconsidering whether or not they wanted to continue to invest in China, because the Chinese Communist Party had taken off the mask and revealed its true face, its brutal face, as it turned out. And many of those, all like myself, who were hopeful about China's future, now took a much more pessimistic view. That's precisely the time when this American teacher went to China and was spent a year teaching English in a southern China university. Tim Walz, however, was at a university, and I know that he was put in charge of the university party committee, who would treat him like a visiting dignitary. And he said, I never received so many gifts as I did in China. I got so many gifts I couldn't bring them back with me. There were too many. Well, why were they whining and dining him? First of all, they wanted to turn him into a friend of China. And they did, because a lot of former friends of China after the Tiananmen massacre said, we're done, we're not going to defend you anymore. And they told him all these fairy tales about how wonderful life was under communism. And because he was talking only to Communist Party members and leaders, he did not get a true picture of what life was like in China. I did. So when he says things like, communism means that everyone is the same and everyone shares, he doesn't realize that he was talking to members of the party, which rides on the backs of the Chinese people and exploits their wealth and their ingenuity and their business acumen to become even wealthier themselves. And finally, Tim Walz said something that wasn't in this article, but I found out later. He said that that the one-child policy was necessary because China has a large population, and if you violate the one-child policy, you only have to pay a fine. No, you don't. If you violate the one-child policy, you will be arrested for the crime of being pregnant. You will be taken in and forcibly aborted and sterilized. I know. I was an eyewitness to women in my commune being arrested for the crime of being pregnant, taken and locked up, and then at the end of the day taken to the local clinic and aborted by Red Army doctors of their babies, who in some cases were unborn children 7, 8, and 9 months gestation. There were cases where babies were killed at birth. Illegal children were not allowed to live under the one-child policy. Now, thank God it ended in 2016. But to say that all you had to do was pay a fine is nonsense. He should have known better, and he didn't.
What would it mean for the United States to elect a vice president who'd be near to being president, who is such a supporter of communist China?
Well, he's not merely an ideological supporter of communist China. Actually, money has changed hands. And when I say that, I mean that his 30 trips, he took 30 trips to China, taking groups of American students to China from Western Nebraska and later from Minnesota. And on those trips, because he said, I had a friend in the Chinese foreign ministry, all of the expenses, the housing and food expenses, when they got to China were paid for by the Chinese government. So these were propaganda tours that Tim Walz organized and took probably over the course of 30 trips, many hundreds of American students to China. He told them, when you get to China, don't be American, don't talk about America, just listen and learn. So these were propaganda tours paid for in large part by the Chinese Communist Party. And since when he was elected to Congress, and since he's been governor of Minnesota, he's had very close relationships with the Chinese American associations in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and elsewhere. He's gone to their events. He's been celebrated at their events. He's actually spoken at their events, encouraging close relations between China and the United States. He has also served on the Congressional Commission on China, at which he has argued against all evidence that China is not an adversary. We should not treat China as an adversary. Well, I believe we should treat China as an adversary because in 2019, Xi Jinping declared that it was in a people's war, quote unquote, with the United States. I believe that China is an adversary because it's carrying out a huge propaganda operation in the United States, setting up Confucius institutes on college campuses, publishing the China Daily in major American cities. There are newspaper boxes everywhere, propaganda outlets, setting up Chinese American associations all over the country, which are run by and report to the local Chinese consulate or the embassy if they're close to Washington, D.C. They're sending people across the southern border. How do I know that? I know that because you can't get out of China without the permission of the Chinese Communist parties. Now, we've asked China who they are. We have retinal scans, we have fingerprints, we have face recognition technology. We asked China who these people are because China knows exactly who they are, but China won't tell us. Now, many of these are economic migrants, but the numbers now are in the hundreds of thousands. And I guarantee you that among this wave of Chinese economic migrants, all of whom have pretty good social credit scores, so they wouldn't be allowed out of the country in the first place, there are certainly potential spies, saboteurs, terrorists, you name it. The Chinese Communist Party would be foolish if it did not implant a certain number of these agents within this massive population that it's allowing to come to Central America, to Mexico, and cross the open, porous southern border. So don't tell me, Tim Walz, that China is not an adversary. It has been for a long time, and it will continue to be.